Concerns over crumbling concrete in schools overshadowed the first day of the new school year for many pupils in the East Midlands. Schools which have discovered they have a weaker form of concrete known as RAAC have been forced to stay shut, leaving children's education disrupted.
Well, at one school in Leicester, where some pupils returned last week, teachers have been dealing with RAAC for months, as Lewis Warner reports.
Summer is over, but for some, school is on hold. The discovery of a weaker type of concrete shutting more than 100 over safety concerns. But pupils at Mayflower Primary School in Leicester have been living with the discovery of RAAC for months. Ever since April, Jamila's two 9-year-old children have been forced to attend another of the city's schools, the prolonged disruption affecting their education.
There were external assessment for year 2 and year 6 that have to have SATs. They didn't take place. My kids who were in year 4 at that time would have had a multiplication test at the end of the year. That didn't take place. As parents, you think, okay, this is terrible and all that. Kids, most of them took it into the stride.
The Prime Minister himself has been accused of cutting the money used to rebuild schools when he was Chancellor, with teachers saying the government should have been more prepared.
This was a form of concrete being used in the 50s, 60s and 70s. It only ever had a 30-year shelf life. It would be nice to think there was somebody, therefore, who had a renewal plan, and we now realise it doesn't. But in 2018, the school actually collapsed. So surely in 2018 onwards, that plan should have been in place. And what we find out now is there hasn't been a plan for that. And the Prime Minister, when he was Chancellor, made it even more difficult to build more schools. But frankly, the people I represent, school and college leaders, the very last thing they needed was this. They should be focusing on learning, and instead they're focusing on whether they've got a particular type of concrete.
The government says the cost of removing RAAC won't fall to individual schools, but the Education Secretary today seemed to shift some of the responsibility, saying it's not the government's job to maintain school buildings.
It is not the job of the Department for Education, but we chose to do that because we wanted to make sure that we had that information centrally. Now we're on it, we will know more than any government in the world about RAAC in our schools because of this process that we've been in. And it's centralised, which is not usually what we do as a government, but we've chosen to do that. We've chosen to take the action, and we will always put the safety of children first.
For now, disruption to education is likely to continue, but families and politicians are agreed that's better than putting children's lives at risk. Lewis Warner, ITV News.
Well, let's speak to our political correspondent Alison Mackenzie, who is in Westminster. Alison, what has the government said in defence of its handling of this crisis?
Well, the first thing to say is that the Prime Minister now, Rishi Sunak, disputes that allegation that as Chancellor he was in charge of some kind of cutting agenda. Very keen today to say in all his interviews that when he became Chancellor he initiated a 500 school project, 50 a year being built, he said, with good money, and in addition to that £5 billion to be spent on a catch-up recovery programme after all the fallout from the pandemic. So he disputes that he was anyway cutting the agenda. Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, has had to defend some choice language she used in her frustration. But most frustrated are the MPs. They've been receiving letters outlining possible schools in their areas that could be affected. There's lots of doubts and worries about that. I spoke to the now independent MP for Leicester East, Claudia Webbe.
For them to be able to come back and be at school and then be told that their school has to shut because of suspected RAAC, or even in the case of one school that they've got RAAC and so they definitely have to shut, and children are being taught online. That is disrespectful to the teachers, to the parents who've had to make short notice alterations, and to the children who are looking forward to a new term. And I think that that's awful and dreadful, and the government really needs to do better.
I think the key allegation here is that the government's playing catch-up on a suggested failure by itself in previous years to adhere to the warnings. They say they're on it, that they're focused on putting things right, but the big question tonight is why is it only now when schools have started to collapse and at the return to lessons? So an insistence they're doing all they can, that money will be found from budgets within Department for Education. It won't be taken from schools' budgets.
Alison, thank you very much.
Well, we know the government has so far refused to publish a full list of more than 100 affected schools. But ITV News has learned of dozens around the country which have been told to close classrooms. And you can view that list online at itv.com/news.